Lepo pozdravljeni na še eni v vrsti naših okroglih miz. Tokrat bomo govorili o vladavini prava, oziroma nekateri to bolj razumejo kot pravo vladavino, pa o pravih medijih in o pravi oziroma seveda pravni državi. Zdaj, jaz sem bila namensko malo pikra v tem naslovu, ko sem se odločala zanj, za kar vem, da je marsikoga zmotilo, ampak mislim, da tisti, ki imate te pojme razčiščene oziroma tisti, ki sledite dogajanju, zelo dobro razumete moj namen s tem naslovom. Za te tematike je skratka res veliko perečih vprašanj, so pa gostje za vsa ta vprašanja, ki so danes z nami, zagotovo pravi. Naj mi gospodje ne zamerijo, ampak se bom tokrat držala nekoliko drugačnega protokola in bom najprej pozdravila ženski del omizja, najprej podpredsednico Evropske komisije in komisarko za vrednote in preglednost, gospo Vero Jourovo. Zelo smo počaščeni, da ste z nami, da ste si vzeli čas, res najlepša hvala. In tu je še odvetnica Jasna Zakonšek, sicer specialistka med drugim tudi za medijsko pravo. Dobrodošli. Preko video povezave so z nami še moj kolega, sicer iz Slovaške, evropski poslanec Michal Šimečka. Mimogrede, tako imenovanim medijem v službi resnice samo sporočam, da naj tokrat le zapišejo njegovo pravo ime, da ne bodo spet narobe poročali, da je gost njegov oče. Živijo Michal. Tu je tudi namestnik direktorja Mednarodnega inštituta za tisk, Scott Griffin. Dobrodošli. In tu sta dva predavatelja, strokovnjaka, profesor evropskega prava Alberto Alemano in profesor novinarstva in medijskih politik Marko Milosavljević. Prisrčno pozdravljena oba. Še en gost je tukaj z nami, predstavljam ga zadnjega, zato ni nič manj pomemben, ampak je dobesedno tukaj z nami. To je predsednik liste Marjana Šarca, nekdanji premier Slovenije, Marjan Šarec. Lepo pozdravljeni.
Lepo pozdravljena, draga Irena in seveda vsi gostje tega omizja. Veseli me, da bomo danes odstrli nova obzorja v tej medijski problematiki. Veseli me, da se bomo pogovarjali s kompetentnimi gosti in verjamem, da bomo po koncu te okrogle mize vsi bogatejši za novo izkušnjo in novo vedenje.
Hvala lepa. Tudi mene res zelo veseli, da imamo tako širok nabor razpravljavcev. Zdaj sem dogodek razdelila na dva vsebinska sklopa. V prvem bomo s komisarko Jourovo, poslancem Šimečko in profesorjem Alemanom govorili širše, torej o evropski perspektivi glede omenjenih tematik, medtem ko bomo v drugem delu razpravljali s preostalimi 4 naštetimi gosti, ampak se bomo osredotočili na razmere v Sloveniji. Preden začnemo, samo še par tehničnih pojasnil za poslušalke in poslušalce, ker imamo v prvem sklopu v celoti goste iz tujine, ki bodo govorili angleško, bom v tem delu angleško govorila tudi sama, je pa zato zagotovljeno simultano tolmačenje tako v slovenščino kot v angleščino. Različica v slovenščini se prenaša v živo na Facebooku, različica v angleščini se prenaša v živo na YouTubeu, podrobnosti so pa vse zabeležene tudi pri tem live prenosu na Facebooku. Jaz upam, da vse to štima. Zdaj gremo pa na prvi vsebinski sklop. Once again, welcome. Vice President Jourova, colleague Šimečka, Professor Alemano. I will not go far into historical development in my introduction. However, before we go into the speeches and the questions I have prepared for you, I just need to make a few remarks to remind the listeners of the essential developments. Because the fact is that a lot is happening and the situation is deteriorating. Sadly, not just in Hungary or Poland anymore, yet it seems that not much is getting done in the sense of concrete, tangible and final solutions. What do I mean by that? The European Union is based on the rule of law, and while the EU has been consistently and gradually evolving its political and legal structure, some unpredicted tensions of recent developments appeared within this structure. Namely, we weren't supposed to have these such sharp tools to stop the democratic backsliding or violations or fundamental rights or protect values among the member states within the EU. It was, supposed to be self-evident that we all act by the values and the principles. Nevertheless, the legal structure of the EU enables some actions from the EU institutions, of course, but those actions are almost always intertwined with political realities and constant tensions within the EU institutions and its member states. So what kind of tools do we have available? First, infringement procedures to take the member states to the European Court of Justice. The second part is the Article 7. And the third is the newly established rule of law mechanism. As far as the court rulings are concerned, many times they take a long time and damage is already done or cannot be reversed. Meanwhile, even though the Article 7 against Hungary and Poland was triggered years ago, and despite the endless urging from the Parliament, the developments remain stalled in the Council, while the rule of law situation continues to deteriorate in both countries and even wider. Portugal, currently holding the presidency, is not organizing a hearing because they cannot meet in person, while the upcoming Slovenian presidency, probably led by the current government, a known ally of Poland and Hungary, also doesn't assure any progress here. Yet, the reason for this discussion is the rule of law mechanism, envisioned by the Commission in 2018, based on the idea of linking the EU budget with the rule of law conditionality, which we managed to achieve in December last year, and now the regulation is in force since January. However, firstly, compared to the original proposal, the regulation was quite watered down in the negotiations between the Parliament and the Council, and also it was limited in scope. Secondly, the European Council summit of the head of governments in December ended with the statement in a so-called political compromise that before triggering this mechanism, the Commission must develop and adopt guidelines for applying the regulation, which will be finalized after the judgment of the ECJ. The purpose of such regulation is, of course, to protect the EU budget, meaning to protect the taxpayers' money all over Union from abuse and corruption, and as a preventive tool to stop the democratic backsliding or violations of the rule of law in the Union. Additionally, I think it's important to note that this mechanism is not intended for specific countries, but it's applied to all member states on objective criteria. Therefore, all of the accusations that this is a tool to discipline the member states is, in my opinion, an argument ill-conceived, but it is also true that there are more violations of rule of law in specific member states. Now, what I want to know is, have we learned enough from the cases of Poland and Hungary for the third is a charm state or case not to happen? With this question in mind, I will now slowly move to Commissioner Jourova's part. I know, dear Commissioner, that you have a very busy schedule and that unfortunately you cannot stay with us until the end. Still, I really, really do appreciate you being here. You have heard my part, and I would especially like to hear your comments about the current state of affairs, because Hungary and Poland have challenged the regulation before the ECJ, as implied in the European Council conclusion. Maybe you could give us some details about the objective guidelines that the Commission is preparing, and especially with the regulation being already valid, whether we are waiting for those guidelines or the court rulings or not. It would be maybe interesting to know, will this mechanism be triggered automatically and retrospectively? Also, I think it is important to explain how would the mechanism ensure that its implementation would not endanger the citizens of the state whose governments are violating the rule of law. I mean, we all here know that you're not, of course, against any member state and that you're striving for objective criteria to be applied in all states equally. But, for example, the authorities in Hungary have accused you of acting against Hungary. They even declared you persona non grata. And speaking of, due to your views on the media freedom and primarily because of your comments on the Slovenian press agency situation here in Slovenia, you are not, how should I say, you are not the most popular with many members of the current Slovenian government too. So to cut to the chase, what are we going to really do to really prevent such situations from occurring all around the Union, while also stop the democratic backsliding of any additional member states, as we know that at least one country besides Hungary and Poland is on its way to join them. So please, Commissioner, thank you, and the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much, Madam Joveva. Thank you for the invitation to deliver this speech in the event focused on the rule of law in the EU. just one personal comment to begin with. I think that if somebody enters politics to be popular, it must be followed by horrible disappointment, because this is almost never the case. And I am here to do my job. I received the portfolio to protect the values, and it seems to be unpopular with many, but also popular with many others. So I receive also a lot of support and courage from many people who also see that if we do nothing against the backsliding of the values like the rule of law and fundamental rights and democracy, then we will get into the trap of the bad past. And I remember bad past. I am the former citizen of Czechoslovakia, and I remember the totalitarian regime very well. But I'm here to explain how I see the use of the new tool, which is the conditionality between the budget and rule of law, which is indeed the new tool, which is complementing the other tools we have to address the problems appearing in the member states, the problems in the field of the rule of law. And indeed, as you said, the first moment of this idea, I remember well, I said it for the first time in Vienna in 2017. And then it was a really big negative reaction from many sides, including the countries who are net contributors to the budget. Something like, this is incredible, this is unimaginable, we cannot apply such a rule. And then over time, I didn't believe much that it will ever be adopted. So the December moment when you say it was watered down, I don't believe so. I am, first of all, glad that it survived the processes, and they were not easy, and it required a lot of efforts. But also that in the current shape and form, it is applicable to fulfill its role. So I want to say where we are now. You are right that the regulation applies from the 1st of January 2021, and we are in the Commission fully committed to enforce it based on monitoring and assessment as from that date. But we need to prepare all the steps that can ensure a successful application of this new tool. You have maybe heard me speaking many times about infringements on the rule of law, saying that when we send cases to the court, we must be absolutely certain of our assessment to ensure that the court comes to conclusions in line with our own findings. In other words, we cannot afford to lose the cases at the Court of Justice, because too much is at stake here. This is about the rule of law principle, which is at the very core of the foundations of the EU. So the Commission believes that always the solid preparatory work and absolute legal certainty must be present when we not only are submitting the cases to the European Court of Justice, but also when we are facing the cases submitted by others. And this is the case now. Poland and Hungary already submitted their proposal, their maybe proposals to the Court of Justice so that the court has the last say, and the Court of in Luxembourg always has the last say on the legality of such tool. And for me, this moment is important to start the application of the tool, having very steady ground under our feet, that the tool will be declared legal by the highest authority, which has the only as the only body the role to interpret the EU law, and that we can start quite safely from the legal point of view to apply to apply this new rule. And so we are now in full speed of preparing the guidelines on some aspects of the application of the regulation, such as how to ensure complementarity with other instruments, the proportionality of the measures, the details of the procedure, and most important, the impact on final beneficiaries. You mentioned it also, Madam Joveva. We try to apply this without how to put it, damaging the final beneficiaries' interests in the member states. And here comes my personal weak point, because I was working 20 years in the sector or in the field of EU funding. And I saw so many very useful projects which really increased the standard of living in our countries. And I saw how heavily needed the money, the EU money, is in the member states. And this is twice the truth now in the COVID time. So we have to think about the proportionality of the measures, and we have to think about the impact on the beneficiaries, and not only think, we have to embed these elements into the guidelines, which will shed light on how the processes will work and how the new tool will be applied. There are a lot of detailed questions which the regulation has not answered. For instance, the retroactivity issue, the many procedural questions. Well, the guidelines will have to be very practical and transparent document, which will be consulted with the member states. And I'm sure that the European Parliament will also be looking at how the guidelines are designed. Definitely, we are not going to further water down the regulation. We just need to bring clarity on how it will work in practice, in line with the regulation. So that's one track of our work. The second track, the parallel track, is the start of the monitoring and screening of the situation in the member states, because as you can imagine, to trigger the process relating to concrete member state, we need to collect a lot of data and facts regarding the situation in the member state based on the criteria which are present in the regulation. And it's different set of criteria from what we have under Article 7 or criteria which we use for applying the infringements. So this requires a lot of fresh analytical work to assess the situation and to come to a conclusion that it can be triggered. And this conclusion must be based on absolute certainty that there is the failure in the rule of law principle, which does harm to EU money. And we need to prove this breach. So we have plenty of work to build the case relating to concrete states, and to be absolutely certain that we can trigger the procedure. And I sometimes hear the criticism that we apply double standards and we are not respecting the equal treatment. So I want to assure you that we will assess alleged breaches in an objective, impartial, and fair manner, with respecting the principle of proportionality. And I am convinced that the use of this new tool, the first decisions we take, will be challenged before the court. This is why I want to be very methodical and very diligent, and also very transparent. We cannot afford to make a mistake if we want this tool to be effective. This is in the interest of all of us who care about the rule of law. This must not be a gesture to apply the tool. It must be the result of the proper analytical work and of the very a highly responsible political decision. And this is what we are ready to do. So this is where we are. I'm afraid I speak too long, but maybe a few more comments. For taking measures under the regulation, any breach of the rule of law has to affect or seriously risk affecting the sound financial management of the union budget or the protection of the financial interests of the union in a sufficiently direct way. This is the breach I spoke about. And the mechanism can only apply to the new money, so to the new budget and the next generation EU money, and not to the running expenditures under the old MFF. This is also one of the things we have to clarify in the guidelines, that which money it will apply to, because still the old budget is financing the projects in the member states, and we must not mix this up. The regulation complements other procedures established by union legislation to protect the EU budget, including OLAF and newly the European Public Prosecutors investigations. The EPPO will start functioning in June this year. I hope. We are doing everything to make this happen. We will continue to use all instruments available to effectively protect the EU budget, including, for instance, the early detection and exclusion system, checks and audits, or financial corrections. This is not purely new thing to stop the funding in the EU. And now, sorry, I have to be a little bit technical. The EU has a rich tradition to freeze the money to the member state where there is the failure to have the properly functioning audit and control system. I was the minister responsible for the funding when we had the frozen money. It was really a difficult situation, and we need to speed up to correct the system. So with this conditionality, we go one floor above. So among other things, you can see in the regulation that if we have doubts that the judiciary system works, or prosecution, or the procurement procedures functioning, then we can apply this tool. So just to tell you that we have the tradition in freezing the money, but I think that this new conditionality is something higher and maybe something more important and less technical. So I don't want to speak too long, but I think I have exhausted a lot of things which I wanted to tell you. From the EU perspective, again, I have to come back to the term rule of law, because sometimes it is by many just reduced to the functioning of judiciary system, and we see the rule of law in broader terms. For instance, in the rule of law report, as you know, which is annually now planned to be updated. The next one will come in July this year. Now we are running the country missions, so it's also the case of Slovenia. We have that broader concept where we also cover not only independence of the judiciary, but also fight against corruption, media freedom and pluralism, and constitutional checks and balances. So I am aware that you will discuss today also more specifically, rather than these general matters, the situation in Slovenia. So let me refer briefly to some issues mentioned in the last report. In the report, there are a number of positive aspects, such as the fact that Slovenia has the legal and institutional framework for preventing and fighting corruption broadly in place. At the same time, the Commission has made its concerns very clear when it comes to media freedom and pluralism. we see in particular frequent verbal attacks against journalists, and this is not acceptable. We are also seriously concerned by the continuous attempts to undermine the sustainable funding and the independence of the National Press Agency in Slovenia. And so we are following the situation in Slovenia with concern, and we expect that swift solutions can be found. You have probably noticed that the Commission is now doing much more than in the past to support the media in the EU. And especially now in COVID context, we are witnessing the paradoxical situation when we need the media most, when we need the information, when we need somebody to bring objective facts and assessment of the facts. We see that the media are under stronger and stronger pressure, not only from economic point of view, but also from the political pressure aspects or perspective. And the security of journalists is worsening. So I would like all the member states to go in the same direction, to recognize the role of the media as not only an economic player, but also as one of the pillars of the democracy. And rather than oppress them and make their lives and functioning more difficult, to support them and to help them to survive this very difficult period, difficult for all, and media alike. So this is how I see the situation. I wish you a fruitful debate, I guess mainly about Slovenia. And I want to stress at the end, referring to the reaction of Mr. Janša, that I am with you at this panel. I am accepting invitations, whoever from. And I like also the debates where there is a confrontation, where I can defend the position of the Commission, where I can hopefully efficiently explain why we are doing many things to defend the rule of law and fundamental rights and democracy. Why? Because simply it's not automatic. These values will not defend themselves. And it's our role to do that. So I just want to say that if I am invited by some other maybe representatives of the European Parliament or national parliaments, those who work with me know that I am always available for a discussion, for open discussion and for cooperation with open cards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear Commissioner, for your comments and for the details you have given us. Also for this last comment, I completely agree with everything that you said. Thank you again for taking the time and being here with us. Stay safe and all the best, of course. I think you have given us also more than enough basis for the further conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you. So I will go now to the next two speakers. Firstly, to my colleague, Šimička. I will start with you. In the Parliament, especially our political family, so the Renew Europe, has really fought very hard in the negotiations with the Council to keep the broader scope of the regulation. We achieved that the independence of the judiciary state, and we were also very critical of the European Council conclusions. So our position is, of course, clear. We called for an expedited procedure within the ECJ and even threatened the Commission to take them to court. Why was this necessary, and how do you see this political compromise? And I mean, why would anybody be against this regulation? And maybe, of course, also if you have any comments on what Commissioner Joveva said.
Yes, thank you very much, and it is indeed a pleasure and an honor to be able to join you on this discussion on a crucial topic at a crucial time in a crucial country from this perspective as well, although obviously virtually. First of all, perhaps a general comment before a few remarks, obviously, on the regulation and on the Parliament's position, and also on what Madam Vice President was saying. But as perhaps a general introduction, it seems to me that we've been having these debates over the past year or even obviously longer, but definitely in this parliament, over how the European Union should finally kind of get a grip on the rule of law and democracy crisis or crisis of its values. And it's true that, you know, a lot has been done in terms of new tools. I mean, we have the rule of law reports. Now we have this regulation. Obviously, we have additional and existing tools, Article 7, and we have the infringement proceedings against, say, Hungary and Poland for breaches of rule of law. The problem is that, or at least I'm getting increasingly frustrated that while we sort of pat ourselves on the back as the EU of how we're, you know, building these new institutions and tools and stuff, but the problem is that the situation on the ground is sort of all the time getting worse. And this is what worries me, that we have lots of debates in the parliament, we have lots of resolutions, we have fancy new tools, but they're all kind of a bit sort of catching up with events. And it's not just obviously the events in Hungary and kind of the attack on independence of the judiciary in Hungary, which is by now almost irreversible, despite the number of rulings by the European Court of Justice, the number of infringement proceedings, despite Article 7. We obviously the situation in Hungary, which again seems, especially when it comes to the media, which by now there's you know, the entire scene of free media is by now, you know, disintegrated by various moves, commercial or governmental from the Orban regime. So it seems to me, you know, while we're talking and building tools, you know, facts on the ground are being created, and obviously there's lots of concern that, especially when it comes to the media, and especially public media, that you might see a similar dynamic in some other member states. That before the EU realizes that, you know, that this is a problem, that it's already, you know, already misses the train. And specifically, I mean, obviously Slovenia, when it comes to media freedom, has been mentioned in this context. So this is kind of a general remark that while we can be satisfied that the EU obviously has, you know, moved a lot since the Lisbon Treaty, but it's nowhere near enough, because simply those illiberal forces or those bent on you know, destruction of rule of law are moving much faster before we can apply our instruments. And that kind of also bridges to the discussion on the regulation. Again, this is it's great that we have it. We should have had it years ago. You know, the notion that European money and the disbursement of European funds should be conditional on the adherence to the basic norms and values and rules that we all subscribe to in the Union, and that especially if this money is paid for by all Europeans and taxpayers. I mean, this is common sense, and this should have been in place all along. But it's okay. It's good that we have it now. Obviously, a belated response to the rule of law crisis, but frankly, before we get it operational, before the guidelines are published, before the European Court of Justice delivers its ruling, it might be too late for Hungary. Obviously, given the electoral calendar. So I have to say I'm frustrated again, and there's one additional element to this with this particular regulation, that not only was it watered down in the autumn during the negotiations, although I have to say that the Parliament, and especially thanks to the existence of the Parliament, the kind of general provisions on the independence of the judiciary are there. So it's not just a tool for fighting corruption, but it's actually a tool for protecting rule of law and taxpayers' money. But nonetheless, it's been watered down. The way it can be triggered is watered down from the reverse conditionality mechanism. But most importantly, there was a deal struck at the European Council, which is not particularly standard. That you have the prime ministers and heads of state instructing the European Commission, or essentially maybe not instructing, but sort of guiding the European Commission to not apply EU law, which is, as of January the 1st, on the books. And the European Commission, we might recall, is duty bound and treaty bound to apply EU law. So this is also why the Parliament, is really pushing for this instrument to be applied soon as possible, because otherwise, as I mentioned in the beginning, it might simply be too late. And this kind of compromise that emerged at the European Council is just just another, to me, it's just another evidence that when push comes to shove, and when obviously the entire EU budget is on the line, then Orban and the Polish leaders, and I hope not, but potentially in the future some other illiberal leaders, can manipulate the rest of the EU, and those powerful leaders and prime ministers simply don't have the courage to stand up to them. So it's not a particularly good omen. But I understand that Madam Vice President of the Commission wants to be careful, because if the Commission makes a mistake now, it's going to be a bad precedent and set us back years. But this cautious approach is not working. Simply look at the situation in Poland, in Hungary, and some other member states, and it's simply not working. So that's probably for my. So sorry to be going on for a bit long, but I think this was important to be said.
No, it's okay. Thank you, Michal. Now I will go to you, Professor Alemano. You were quite critical of the European Parliament's legal service, and actually with some of your colleagues you even proposed that you could legally represent the Parliament pro bono. So what are your comments until what you heard now on this roundtable, and what can or should we do now to speed the things up?
Thank you, Irena Joveva, and also Michael, for this opportunity to share a few reflections on the situation. I regret the Commissioner couldn't stay with us to listen our conversations and to respond to our questions, because obviously we have a lot of questions to ask her. It is no mystery that the academic, judicial community, but also civil society, is losing passions and remains puzzled by some of the arguments and the overall strategy Michael alluded to. The fact that the Commission is afraid to lose a case before the Court of Justice is unfortunately a very implausible argument. The Court of Justice is the ultimate authority whose job is to uphold the rule of law, but the court cannot task itself. It needs somebody to go before it, and this is the European Commission. So that argument is not very convincing, in particular, given the nature of the breaches we're discussing, given the fact that the same Court of Justice has been already judged a lot of behavior as against the rule of law, and those judgments today remain unsatisfied, meaning they have not been complied with by those states, and the Commission is not bringing those states before the court again under Article 260, if not in exceptional circumstances. This in itself is slightly suspicious. So I agree with Michael. This approach of taking the time and trying to show to the world that they're doing their homework is simply not credible. And it clearly transpires a lack of political will, which is not Ms. Jourova's will, but is the college, as epitomized by Ms. von der Leyen, who is clearly not using the full prerogatives that exist for the Commission to uphold the rule of law. It is not only about judgment not be complied, it is also about not using or asking for interim measures when introducing infringement actions when those are needed. It's also about not introducing infringement actions when the breach is manifest, like in the case of the composition of the Constitutional Court in Poland, as the Parliament and the same Commission had recognized. So this is somehow paradoxical, right? Everybody is seeing that the Commission is doing its preparatory work up to a point, and then when is the point to actually push the button? Think about Article 7, as Irene remember, we never had such a vote, right? We know there will be this kind of veto, mutual veto between Poland and Hungary. We never reached that stage. So again, this situation, I think, has been going on for too long. And I think your question is a much more interesting question. In other words, how can we potentially go out? Can we overcome such an impasse? And I think we cannot let alone the Commission. We cannot simply obsess on the Commission doing its job, because what we're witnessing today is something much deeper, right? If you have been reading Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes' analysis, saying, well, at the end of the day, liberalism hasn't been taken into account major questions of redistribution and equality, which in Central European countries have caused major divides in the population. And this is what caused certain political parties to emerge. This is a much deeper debate that shows that the Commission technically has all the prerogatives it needs, but politically is not well supported because it doesn't have a political majority within this parliament and in the council to feel comfortable to play its role. Sorry to speak a bit, how can I say, in a free manner by saying what I feel, what I observe, but the situation is very dire and it won't improve in the coming weeks or months. This is the political approach, which is there to stay till 2024. And this means that we're going to see many more acceleration in the breaches of the rule of law. And the precedent that Michael reminded us, the UCO conclusions of last December, de facto suspending the application of a regulation, is simply represent the cherry of the cake. The Commission saying we cannot use this instrument because we need to prepare guidelines, which were not even foreseen by the regulation, is deeply problematic. This would deserve the Commission be brought before the Court of Justice for a failure to act, exactly what the Parliament has been written in its own resolution. I really hope that some of this political will, which is a bit of a minority, I mean, is formally a majority, but is not very strong, will translate into action. I really hope so. Perhaps a few concluding words on what to do, because again, this is your question beyond the diagnosis. It's important, the diagnosis, but it's also important to think how we can get out of this current situation. How do we generate the political dynamics that would push the European Union to make full use of the instruments available? Again, the law alone doesn't suffice. We need something more. And we need to look for support in the political process, but also in civil society. I think Europe today would look very different, and the Commission would have found the political courage it lacked today if civil society managed to be more vocal and more aware. What does it mean? It means about trying to use horizontally the mechanism we have. We cannot leave the Commission alone to be the guardian of the treaties. We need to empower states to be able to introduce infringement action against those countries. Why? Because the lack of judicial independence in Poland or in any other country is affecting citizens living, residing in another member of the European Union. The cross-border effect of the breach of the rule of law are already felt in Europe, and this justifies member states' action. At the same time, we can imagine NGOs and a panoply of other actors to use the tool available in the treaties to actually create this pressure, not only on the Commission, but also on the relevant member states. We are not even trying to do so. Our civil society organizations are not necessarily using those possibilities by showing that the Commission can rely on civil society at the transnational level because there is a demand for action. I don't see this happening from the bottom up, but the bottom up could be a major differentiating factor in that particular approach. Final point, why companies, big corporations that are benefiting from regulatory regimes, tax regimes in countries where the rule of law is breached are not also speaking out. And I know some companies, which are not necessarily those favored by the current ruling parties, that would be ready to speak out, but for companies, difficult to get political. But if certain companies, if certain investors would stop their economic activities by becoming much more political in the way in which they claim the economic space they need to thrive, obviously the answer from the political system would be very different. All these levers of change are not even visible. We are not even discussing them. But given the current impasse in the approach of the European Commission, which is there to stay, we need to be creative. And we have to connect the dots among these different actors and creating what I call an enabling environment for the rule of law to become a reality, not simply an abstract concept, but something that really is changing people's life in even economic dynamics. I close on this, but happy to continue the conversation with all of you.
Thank you, Professor Alemano. Michal, back to you. I'm sure that you will probably also have a comment on what Professor Alemano said. But additionally, I would maybe like to ask you also about the media freedom issues, because given the severe problems with it, how can we protect the media autonomy if we cannot use the rule of law mechanism to do so? So should we be able to use the mechanism also here? And the same goes also for other areas such as the protection of civil society, NGOs, and so on. So please, Michal.
Thank you, Irena. First of all, on media freedoms, this is notoriously difficult for the European Union to intervene in these matters, because I mean there's all sorts of legal arguments that the European Union that it's outside of the competence of the EU. I don't buy into that, actually. First of all, when it comes to freedom of the media, it is part of, and when Madam Vice President talked about the rule of law, she specifically said, and I fully agree, that when we speak about the rule of law, it's not just about institutions of the criminal justice system, which is exactly why the European Parliament wanted to have a rule of law mechanism, both for monitoring and for enforcement, that kind of covers the full scope of European values, including democracy, including fundamental rights, and frankly, including freedoms such as freedom of the media, freedom of the press. So this should fall under the general scope of whenever we talk about the kind of rule of law instruments that the EU has. This I think this should indeed be a part of it, as should fundamental rights, as should democracy, integrity of elections. These are all things that I think not only should be part of the annual report, but should also be part of any enforcement mechanism. So kind of that's because in reality, what you see in many member states, and Hungary is a good example, and I hope Slovenia will not be, but for the moment, what you see, and in Poland as well, is that destruction of the rule of law in the traditional sense, being independence of judiciary, checks and balances, often goes hand in hand with violation of fundamental rights, or indeed suppression of freedom of the media. It is often part of the same political context and same political reality, because it's part of the same political strategy of that ruling party. So you can't kind of see it outside of this context that it's somehow we only look as the EU, we're only concerned by whether your judges are appointed by politically independent process, or whether how well your prosecution works. I mean, it absolutely has everything to do with whether the public broadcaster is independent of political control, or whether there is enough freedom for public media or for journalists themselves to pursue their work, or whether a country does not, or government does not engage in discrimination against minorities or in hate, in hate speech. All of this, unfortunately, in the empirical context that we're seeing, and specifically in Hungary and Poland, goes hand in hand. The problem with, or the problem, the LGBTI free zones are intricately linked to the destruction of the Polish independent justice. It's the same problem in a way, and failure of the EU so far has been seeing it that way. It only sees kind of just a very narrow section of it, and I think media definitely should be part of that full picture. So that's kind of a more general comment. And when it comes to the sort of tools that we can, they're actionable, so to speak. I think, and obviously I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is that the EU has plenty of powers when it comes to competition law, when it comes to and this could apply to the media sector. But I mean, you have instances, and again, looking at Hungary and Poland, where you have private media, especially media critical of the government, squeezed out of advertising, where you have unfair practices, you have monopolies being created, or all of these things. So in a way, the Commission could have a look at the tools related to the internal and to the single market and to competition and state aid to actually act against suppression of freedom of the media. And I remember when we had the debate in plenary with Madam Vice President, and she actually said that the Commission is looking into new tools how to protect journalists and protect the media. And so I'm still, waiting for that to be announced. And last but not least, obviously, the EU, what the EU should be doing is supporting journalists financially, politically. We will have a new budget. We have a new rights and values program. I think that definitely there has to be a dedicated kind of budget line for supporting independent journalism, both at national level as well as local level. Because as we know, as Timothy Snyder keeps reminding us, this is the single most important thing any of us can do to save democracy is to buy a local newspaper. And I think this again is something that the European Union could and should do.
Thank you, Michal. Actually, more or less the same question for you, Professor Alemano. What do you think about this possible connection between the rule of law and the media? Should it be more connected and more sharp tool for these situations?
No doubt. I fully agree with what Michael has been saying so far. There are loopholes, there are inconsistencies in the way in which the rule of law toolbox came into being. Also, the rule of law report should actually play a much greater role in terms of evidentiary burden to be used than in infringement actions and in the conditionality regulation. This is not the case. And as you might have noticed today, this is also used as an excuse, as a justification, as a tactic to somehow delay the way in which the Commission should be using those competencies and prerogatives. So paradoxically, the fact of having enlarged the toolbox has not accelerated the use of the tools, has actually created some further, I would say, difficulties for those of us who actually expect those tools to be used, to be put in full use by the Commission itself. This is a real paradox, is an unintended consequences. Obviously, we were all very well-intentioned to push for an improvement of those tools. But when you look at the reality today, also the political reality, not only the legal one, you clearly see that there are major inconsistencies. On the Slovenia story, I think it's a bit too early to say, but it is clear that the Commission has a lot of entry points to be used exactly in the same way we have seen infringement actions using the angle of the internal market for the telecom market in many countries, not only in Central European countries, also in a country like Italy, which I know well because that's where I come from. And there's no reason why they should not be used here. However, the current situation in Slovenia still deserves some scrutiny because there's been a lot of constitutional hardball, as was described in Verfassung blog today, the tactic of the president to somehow get the attention and to disrupt the political system by aligning itself. But there are also economic interests which certainly would deserve, given the overall framework, some action today. In a nutshell, I think that we are seeing a situation in which the critical infrastructure of the European Union is lacking. We don't have European political parties today visible to the citizens, able to raise their voice, and we don't see a European pan-sphere, a pan-European sphere that is somehow fostering a debate whereby citizens in neighboring countries, say in Germany or in Austria, might be interested in knowing what is happening to the media landscape in Slovenia. This remains a little bit the original scene of the current situation. And that's why I think the report that I read from Ruiz de Vesa only from last week on the rule of law clearly make an argument along the line suggested by Michael. So really strengthening and ensuring more consistency in the tools available in order to strengthen this critical infrastructure of our European democracy. This is a way to go. And interestingly enough, the same member of the European Parliament is also responsible for the reform of the electoral law. And this is the other piece of the puzzle, I think, to get this right before 2024.
Thank you, Professor Alemano. Before I thank you both for attending, because unfortunately we are already short of time, I will give you just a minute or two for each of you to maybe make some final remarks, maybe also emphasize the situation in Slovenia, and just one question for maybe to provide some food for thought for the final comment. Why do you think, Michal, that the methods of some Eastern leaders seem more authoritarian and try to create a cultural or historical struggle, even if we know that it is not about that, it's about the equal opportunities and respecting the basic values fundamental to the democratic system?
Thank you very much, Irena, although I can't possibly imagine how I can answer that in 1 minute, because that is a huge question you just posed there. I mean, obviously, I can try to answer and try to sort of explain a bit, you know, the kind of the central Eastern European perspective and sort of historical context and political context. But I would want to make this final point. And first of all, obviously, it's pure propaganda what Orban and the likes, and I'm sure you hear that from the Slovenian government, is saying that all of these sort of, you know, rule of law talk or talk of media freedom or, you know, Article 7 and all of these things are just made up, you know, arguments by Brussels or the liberals to punish countries which are conservative or are against immigration or whatever. I think, and this is something that, you know, we have to be able to dismiss, you know, out of hand, because everybody who reads those regulations or this or you know, reads those materials, it's absolutely clear what it is about. That it's about, you know, it's about rule of law, it's about independent justice, it's about access to justice, it's about freedom of the media, as we have in our constitutions, by the way. So the reason why they're making that argument, that propaganda, is obviously clear, because this is you know, politically expedient. I'm not sure this is specifically Central Eastern European. I think I could well imagine it happening in some other country, even West European and Southern European country. And this is the final point that I would like to make. And this is that we're obviously discussing about this crisis of values. We're seeing, you know, journalists being murdered in Slovakia and Malta, now in Greece. We're seeing, you know, huge pressure by the government, by the prime minister on public media and intimidation and harassment of journalists in Slovenia. And we think that we have to do something because of the values themselves, which we hold dear and which we are, you know, absolutely convinced that they lead to best possible governance. And that's true. But also, and I also should stress that this is also about the survival of the European Union in practical terms, because if we allow, you know, one or two member states or more member states to basically, you know, become entrenched illiberal countries or less than democracies, or even sort of hybrid regimes or non-democracies, then that's going to be the beginning of the European Union, because it cannot function like that. We cannot have a union in which, you know, some member states are democracies, other member states are sort of, you know, halfway between democracies and dictatorships, and then you have a couple of, you know, authoritarian leaders in it. This is not going to work, because the European Union, for it to function, for the internal market to function, for the Schengen system to function, for the euro to function, for all the policies, you know, you absolutely have to have that kind of trust between the member states, between their leaders and between their administrations and their judges and their parliamentarians to sustain that, because the European Union doesn't have a federal government which could sort of impose, you know, these common policies. They are sustained by that trust, and that trust, on the other hand, is sustained by the notion that we're all democracies. And when 27 heads of state, you know, sit at the council, they trust each other because they believe that all are elected through a democratic process and more or less adhere to the same values. And once you sort of dispense of that, and once you say, well, never mind, we'll have, you know, we don't need 27 democracies for the EU to function. Well, it's not going to function. It's going to break down. And you're seeing elements of it now with member states such as the Netherlands basically refusing to accept verdicts by the Polish justice system. And this is so it's going to compromise the EU's kind of legal architecture, and sooner or later, you know, all the various policies that we have, our common policies, are going to crumble. So that's what I'm trying to say, that it's not just about those values, although those are hugely important. It's also about the European Union not being able to survive in any other state than a union of democracies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michal. I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you very much for your comments and thoughts. And of course, I give the floor now for the final thoughts. In a minute or two, please, Professor Alemano.
Thank you. Well, obviously, I also agree on this pretty gloomy diagnosis. I would be even more cynical by saying that the scenario that Michael gave us, it's part of the reality of today. We already witness a coexistence of democracies and autocracies. We see the European legal regimes suspended, also because of COVID. We see the Schengen space already questioned with major restrictions, if you think about Ireland these days, which are manifestly against European law and free movement, basically discriminated based on nationality. We see the European judicial system in the mutual trust linking our judges already question is no longer there. And even the European harmonization framework, if you look at the pharmaceutical, in this case, vaccines, being questioned because we are basically departing from an harmonized approach in this kind of emergency situation. So let's face it, Europe 2021 doesn't look as Europe 2018. There's a major acceleration in an implosion of the Union, where the political forces really struggle to find the right balance between fighting back, as you are doing, both of you in your respective political spaces, and those who are actually seizing this as an opportunity to make electoral goals and to basically score points and to advance their own political agenda. It is very sad to see Europe being treated once more as an object, as opposed to a subject and a common space of identity. A final point, since Irene asked me about, there are a lot of people in Europe, many academics, many professionals who really believe that it is worth giving support to people like you, to elected representatives of all Europeans as you are under the Treaty of Lisbon, and to provide support. That is the aim of the Good Lobby Profs. So we are more than 60 academics coming from all over Europe and also from outside of Europe, willing to basically help members of the European Parliament, national parliamentarians, but also civil society organizations and some of the victims of the major violations of the rule of law. That's what we've been trying to do. We have been launched also thanks to the support of some of your own communities only a few weeks ago. But since then, you cannot imagine how many requests for help we have been receiving from all different points, in particular on the LGBT-free zones. We are helping now in Poland, but we have also matched, meaning we are providing this pro bono support to many other projects. So it's already running, and I really hope this will potentially trigger, although being just a little pilot, a little bit experiment, a bit of a drop in the ocean, it might trigger some positive dynamics that might also be picked up and perhaps inspire many other communities across Europe. This is our hope. But thank you so much for this opportunity and keep up with your great work.
Thank you very much. Thank you to both of you. Thank you so much for taking the time and all of the comments. I will now switch to Slovenian because we're going to the second part of our round table. Jaz mislim, da je bila razprava tega prvega dela zelo na mestu, predvsem zaradi razmer v Sloveniji, o katerih bomo govorili zdaj, ker se vsak dan odpirajo nekako nove in nove problematične zadeve, še zlasti oziroma od nastopa aktualne vlade dalje. Zdaj jaz bi lahko vse to naštevala do jutri, ampak toliko časa nimamo, ker je toliko tega in kar je najhuje, vedno bolj se nekako intenzivira vse skupaj, medtem ko je slovensko predsedovanje Svetu Evropske unije za vogalom. Jaz bi začela kar z predsednikom Liste Marjana Šarca, gospod Šarec. Zdaj smo v 1 uri lahko zelo jasno slišali, da vprašanje vladavine prava ni nacionalna politika in ni ideologija. Jasno je tudi, da smo v Sloveniji ne ravno na neki zgledni poti. V tem trenutku ste si kdaj mislili, da gredo stvari lahko tako zelo daleč?
Ja, res je. Težko je razumeti zadnje dogajanje, poznavajoč politiko Janeza Janše in stranke SDS zadnja leta, pa niti ne. Zdaj, vladavina prava je temeljni postulat Evropske unije. Na tem je tudi zrastla in Slovenija je bila doslej vedno zagovornica vladavine prava. Vedno smo bili tisti, ki s tem nismo imeli težav. Zdaj smo se postavili, oziroma ta vlada nas je postavila zdaj na neko agendo, ki gre kontra vsem. To bližamo se, oziroma smo že skoraj de facto v Višegradu in to bo zagotovo vplivalo tudi na naše predsedovanje. Ta strašna želja predsednika vlade po predsedovanju je zdaj že utonila, ker mislim, želja je še, ampak efekta pa ne bo, oziroma bo napačen efekt in se je to predsedovanje že sfižilo, preden se je začelo, ker postali bomo izolirani. Mislim, da zadnja dejanja, pa tudi to, kar so povedali gosti zdaj v pretekli uri, kažejo na to, da bodo vsi samo komaj čakali, da to predsedovanje mine in da ga potem prevzame naslednja država. In to, kar se dogaja s Slovensko tiskovno agencijo, to se ne more zgoditi v neki demokratični evropski državi in zdelo se mi je zanimivo ravno to, ko je bilo rečeno, da bo Evropska unija, mislim, da je gospod Šimečka to povedal, da Evropska unija bo težko obstajala, če bomo imeli neke države, ki bodo demokratične in če bomo imeli druge države, ki so na papirju demokratične, v bistvu pa avtoritarne. In mi trenutno nismo ravno na dobri poti, oziroma smo pravzaprav tonemo. In v Sloveniji se moramo začeti vsi zavedati, da če bomo kar stali ob strani, če bomo tiho, če ne bomo storili nič, potem se ne bo dobro končalo.
Mogoče preden nadaljujemo še en pogled od zunaj, v narekovajih, namestnik direktorja Mednarodnega inštituta za tisk je namreč tudi z nami, gospod Scott Griffin. Že v poročilu glede vladavine prava za lansko leto glede Slovenije je bilo v poglavju svobode medijev objavljeno, da je pri nas stanje problematično, pa takrat v bistvu te najhujše kršitve v državi, ki jih je nekako naredila aktualna vlada, takrat sploh še niso bile storjene. Aktualni premier Slovenije se več kot očitno zgleduje po vodjih Madžarske in Poljske, ker je situacija v Sloveniji očitno nekako copy-paste metoda od tam. Kako vi ocenjujete to dogajanje pri nas?
Sure. Thanks a lot. I hope you can hear me well. And thank you very much for the invitation. It's been a really interesting discussion so far, I have to say, and a really important one. I'm going to come to your question, but I think it's important a little bit to understand where we are in terms of the trends of the wider region. And I think that I agree very much with what Michal was saying early on, that we are really in a race against time, I think, when it comes to defending media freedom, not only in Slovenia, but in the wider region. And if you look at the situation in Hungary and Poland, it's really very serious. And in particular, in the case of Hungary, the damage is severe. And it's something that has taken place slowly over the past 10 years, in which we now have a media environment which is almost completely captured by the state in one way or the other. And not only the media environment, but also many of the state institutions and structures which are part of the overall notion of the rule of law. If you look at the prosecutors, prosecutors' offices and judiciary in a wider sense. So it's a really very serious situation. I think I also completely agree with the previous speakers that, while we sit here talking about how to implement these different measures in the conditionality regime, we are seeing these negative trends accelerate. And then I point, for example, in Hungary to last month, in which the Klub Radio, which was the very last independent radio broadcaster in Hungary, was finally kicked off the air. And closed basically by an act of the state and an act of official censorship through the Media Council, which is this party-controlled body completely controlled by Fidesz. These are very dramatic developments. Hungary is very far down this authoritarian road. If you look at Poland, we are in a slightly different place. I think we can speak in a way that Poland is on a precipice. That we have some very alarming trends in Poland, which are not exactly the same in Hungary, but mirror those trends in different ways towards this concept of state capture. But we are in a moment where it's not clear how bad things will get, although we are deeply concerned. And I point to a couple of recent developments. We've seen now a state-controlled oil company which has purchased the leading publisher of regional media in Poland from the former German owner, which is in its own an alarming picture, I think, but raises serious concerns about the future of independent media in Poland and the ability of the government to determine the editorial line of a huge number of media. And that actually has been blocked by a court temporarily, which I think is a very important development and a sign of the interlinks between judicial independence and media freedom. And another alarming development actually today was the ruling by the Constitutional Court, which it looks like will kick the human rights ombudsman Adam Bodnar out of office, which is actually a negative example of the interlinks between judicial independence and media freedom. Mr. Bodnar has been a vocal supporter of media independence. When we talk about Slovenia, I think we are in a slightly different situation. It's obvious that Slovenia is not as far down the road as Hungary and Poland, but the serious troubling signs are there. And I think that, this is the moment where we need a very strong intervention. And we see that the damage by the lack of intervention, in particular by the European Commission, but by other parties as well in Hungary and Poland. I don't want to say the situation in Hungary is irreversible, because no situation is irreversible, but it is very far down the road, and Poland is moving quickly too. So I think in Slovenia, we are at a moment where we really need to grapple with these threats to media freedom and counter them now as strongly as we can. And I think it's difficult to say that Slovenia is a copy somehow of Hungary, because each country has a slightly different media market. There are different forces at play, but we do see that some of the same types of ways to delegitimize and undermine the work of critical journalism are taking place here in Slovenia. I think there are two big ones at the moment. One are the constant verbal attacks, threats, and harassment of critical journalists, of independent journalists in Slovenia by some of the country's highest political officials, including the president. And this is a very serious topic, and I'm happy that Vice President Joveva raised it as well. And we really do feel that these attacks are placing journalists, independently of the fact that they undermine public trust in the media, and they sort of make it much more difficult for journalists to do their jobs, to reach the public, and to exercise this watchdog role. I think there are legitimate concerns as well about the physical safety of journalists. The more people are told that journalists are traitors, that they are enemies, that they are somehow antithetical to national values, I think that people will begin to see them as targets, and that's something that's extremely concerning to us. And the second major issue right now, which has been raised several times, are the attacks on public media, both on the public broadcaster as well on the national news agency. And this absolutely mirrors trends that we've seen in other countries, in Hungary and Poland. Our experience is that when it comes to these efforts to systematically shift the media environment towards a pro-government media environment, that public media are usually the first chips to fall, so to speak. In a way, they're the easiest target. And I don't mean to say anything negative about public media. It's just because of their close links to this, to public bodies, the way that the funding is, it tends to be easier for governments to undermine the work of public broadcasting. And we know that, in Hungary and Poland, the public broadcasters there don't even deserve the name. They're nothing more than propaganda instruments. And I think that's why it is right to fight very hard for the existence of independent public media, as well as a public news agency in Slovenia. They play an extremely important role in informing the public. I think particularly in smaller media environments, smaller media markets, such as Slovenia. these developments can happen very quickly. I mean, it was just shortly after the Peace Party took power in Poland that critical journalists were switched out at the public broadcaster, and we saw a complete shift towards a pro-government message, which was very evident also during last year's presidential elections. And Hungary, of course, is very much in the throes of propaganda, public media. So I think that, again, we can't say that Slovenia is Hungary. It isn't. But I think our work should be focused on ensuring that it doesn't become Hungary. It doesn't become Poland. And that is why I think the focus on the media freedom developments in Slovenia are very important. And it's absolutely legitimate that we are putting a lot of emphasis and priority on these topics at the moment.
Najlepša hvala. Gospa Zakonšek, zdaj grem k vam. Vi ste specialistka za medijsko pravo. Vem, da ste imeli oziroma da imate veliko strank iz te sfere. Zdaj v zadnjem letu so se razmere nekako še bolj poslabšale, tudi kar se tiče diskreditacij novinarjev, da ne rečem še kaj hujšega. Koliko dela imate več zaradi tega in kako vi z vašega vidika gledate na vso to situacijo doma?
Hvala za povabilo. Res je, kot ste rekli, odvetnikom oziroma odvetniškim pisarnam dela najbrž ne bo zmanjkalo, vendar pa hkrati recimo tudi opažamo, kar je ravno tako zaskrbljujoče, da je neka resigniranost pri novinarkah, novinarjih, ker pač je teh napadov v zadnjem času ali pa v zadnjih mesecih toliko, da je nekako in kar težko sledijo, težko na nje reagirajo. Poleg tega pa seveda zaradi COVID situacije, tako pri nas kot povsod v Evropi in po svetu, je tukaj še vprašanje nekih, ker je vedno povezano z postopki, pravni postopki, vprašanje financ, ali se spustiti v kakšne postopke, ali bodo zmogli, pa seveda trajanje teh postopkov. Tako da stanje, se strinjam s prejšnjimi sogovorniki, je vsekakor zaskrbljujoče in menim, da ni dovolj in ni smiselno in pametno, da bi čakali, ampak je treba reagirati res, na kar se da reagirati že zdaj. Tako da to je ena taka situacija, ki je morda tudi ne moramo pustiti, da jo ljudje sami individualno rešujejo.
Hvala lepa. Profesor Milosavljević, ne moramo mimo komuniciranja Janeza Janše, tvitanje je eno, čeprav seveda to ne pomeni, da je upravičeno pisati karkoli komurkoli, ampak je tukaj še komunikacija ne samo z novinarji, tudi s člani Evropskega parlamenta, komisije, skratka s tistimi, ki Janši nekako upajo kaj povedati nazaj, le da običajno tista stran odgovarja z dejstvi. Zdaj tudi vas niso ravno v narekovajih šparali potem, ko ste povedali zadeve na razpravi glede razmer v Sloveniji v Evropskem parlamentu. Kako vi kot strokovnjak na tem področju gledate na vse skupaj?
Najprej hvala lepa za povabilo. Glejte, vsakdo, ki se v Sloveniji v tem trenutku izpostavi, vsakdo, ki izreče skoraj kakršnokoli kritiko na račun vlade, predsednika vlade ali ključnih ljudi v vladi, mora nekako računati na to, da bo postal tarča. In da bo postal seveda tudi tarča sistematičnega napada, nekako verjetno koordiniranega ali vsaj nekako usklajenega. Ampak to je neka nova naša stvarnost. Verjetno je namen tega predvsem tako imenovani chilling efekt, torej nekakšno diskretno šikaniranje ali pa manj diskretno šikaniranje ali ustrahovanje tudi drugih ljudi, ki bi se potencialno odločili za izpostavljanje v javnosti. In to smo v minulem letu videli pri mnogih osebah, v tujini pri tovrstnih strategijah govorimo o tako imenovanih vnaprejšnjih napadih oziroma preemptive strikes, torej gre za dejstvo, da se napade bodisi osebe, ki bi potencialno lahko bile nevarne, konkurenčne in tako naprej, ali seveda osebe, ki se dejansko oglasijo. Ko gre za vprašanje sicer, recimo temu širšega koncepta, tako na eni strani vladnega, premierjevega in drugega komuniciranja tako z javnostjo kot mediji in z novinarji, je seveda treba upoštevati, da je to način, ki v Sloveniji v resnici v preteklosti ni bil prisoten. Ni bil prisoten zato, ker je način komunikacije v Sloveniji bil v preteklosti vendarle na nekem drugem nivoju. Ne glede na to, kakšne tabloidne medije smo imeli, kakšne posameznike, ki so verjetno bili enako vulgarni ali enako agresivni, nekateri mogoče enako primitivni, vendar jim verjetno družbena omrežja tega niso omogočala, oziroma ker jih seveda torej ni bilo pred 15 leti. MySpace ali Second Life pač nista bila neke relevantni družbeni platformi za izrekanje političnih stališč pred 15 leti. In torej zato je prišlo do tega obrata v zadnjih 10 letih. Verjetno je bilo prisotno, ampak v tem času je samo eskaliralo. Kar se je še zgodilo v tem zadnjem letu, je seveda, da se je to zgodilo izredno hitro, ampak v resnici nas to ne sme presenečati, ker če smo spremljali in ker smo spremljali komunikacijo nekaterih ključnih ljudi, njihovo osebno ali formalno ali strankarsko, potem nas seveda napadi na javno radio-televizijo, napadi na STA, napadi na Pop TV, napadi na mnoge posameznike, konkretno z imeni, pa tudi seveda na lastnike, v resnici ne more presenetiti. Lahko nas preseneti način, lahko nas preseneti stopnja tudi neke vulgarnosti, posebej neke škodoželjnosti do recimo žensk, do ženskih novinark, do urednic. Tudi gotovo iza tega stoji seveda tudi določen seksizem, vendar pa nas to, kot pravim, presenetiti ne more. Bolj je ključno vprašanje seveda, kaj naj storimo.
Gospod Šarec, vi ste se tudi udeleževali vseh teh zasedanj v Bruslju, najbrž nam lahko poveste kakšno vašo osebno izkušnjo ali pa mogoče z političnega vidika, kaj pomenijo ta, v narekovajih, grupiranja voditeljev in ta zavezništva, zato ker zdaj vemo, da se aktualni premier nagiba oziroma usmerja v nekaj čisto drugega, kot ste se usmerjali vi, in najbrž tudi kakšen od predhodnikov vas mogoče tudi kdo kontaktira in reče, kaj za vraga se dogaja.
Ja, v politiki je tako, da ni nekih prijateljstev, so samo neki skupni interesi in seveda normalno je pri zunanji politiki ali pa znotraj Evropske unije, da se formirajo neka ad hoc zavezništva, ki so pomembna ob določeni temi. Recimo, ko gre za kohezijo, je Slovenija tam, kjer so kohezijske države, ko gre za vladavino prava, je spet se ve, kdo jo podpira in kdo jo ne. Skratka, Slovenija je bila takrat zagotovo neproblematična, doma so nas napadali, da nas noben ne pozna, da ne vem kaj vse, ampak dejansko smo bili neproblematični, ker Slovenija ni nikoli imela protievropskih stališč, nikoli ni bila na tej strani, da bi javno podpirali kršenje človekovih pravic, da bi podpirali vse to, o čemer danes govorimo. In če se spomnite, sem tudi sam dal poziv, da naj državne firme ne oglašujejo v medijih, ki podpirajo sovražni govor. Noben medij ni bil omenjen, pa so tako imenovani mediji iz sfere SDS in tam okoli se oglasili, da jih zatiram. Torej, sami so se prepoznali v tem, nihče ni bil imenovan in takrat seveda marsikdo ni razumel, zakaj tak pojav. Tudi marsikdo ni razumel leta 2018, zakaj smo se trudili s sestavo vlade, kljub temu, da smo vedeli, da bo manjšinska, da bo težko, danes je vsakemu jasno. Ravno zato, da ne bi danes govorili o tem in če ne bi 2018 sestavili tiste vlade manjšinske, vprašanje, kje bi danes že bili. Torej, naj nadaljujem tam, kjer je gospod Milosavljević končal, kaj storiti. Storiti nam je to, da vsak od nas stori vse, kar je v naši moči, da ne podležemo. Se pravi, zdaj bom mogoče malce za kakšnega novinarja tudi zoprn, pa bom rekel, da nam v politiki, seveda boste rekli, ja, politiki morate biti tega navajeni. Seveda, se strinjam. Ampak mi smo tarča, jaz osebno tarča napadov tovrstnih medijev iz te sfere že ves čas, odkar sem, ne vem, stopil v predsedniško tekmo pred 4 leti. Zame to ni nič novega. Jaz imam take napade za zajtrk. Seveda, za novinarje, ki so pa vajeni neke civilizirane politike, ki so navajeni neke normalne politike, ki so navajeni, da na vprašanje dobijo odgovor, ki so navajeni, da je Slovenija demokratična družba in pravzaprav si nihče od nas ni mislil, da se kdaj lahko to zgodi, je pa to šok. Ampak ta šok je nameren, zato da bi se ustrašili, zato da bi prenehali, zato da bi, kaj je to izčrpavanje STA drugega kot obleganje. To je kot obleganje nekega mesta in izčrpavanje, stradanje toliko časa, da bo nekdo popustil. A ne? In tudi drugi novinarji. Samo ne pokazati strahu. To je največja napaka, pokazati strah. Mi moramo povedati vsi skupaj, da se tega ne bojimo, da se bomo s tem borili in da tudi se borimo in da še zdaleč situacija v Sloveniji ne bo prišla tako daleč, kot je drugje, ker smo mi tukaj za to. Vsi skupaj. Ker, veste, vseeno tega ekstremizma ni veliko, je pa glasen. Glasen je pa zato, ker smo v večini, seveda, Slovenci taki, da se ne radi izpostavimo, da ne radi karkoli povemo in to omogoča potem ekstremistu, da širi svoje ideje. Ni kriv ekstremist, mislim v osnovi ja, ampak kriv je tisti, ki to dopušča. Torej, nikar strahu, nikar dvomov, ali delamo prav, kajti delamo prav. In Slovenija mora postati spet utirjena v normalno evropsko pot in poskrbeti moramo, da je to zgolj epizoda, ne pa stalno stanje.
Gospod Griffen, tudi vas bom vprašala glede Janševega komuniciranja. Sicer ste že omenili in rekli ste, strinjam se, Slovenija ni Madžarska in ni Poljska, je pa na poti tja, to sem tudi sama že večkrat povedala. Ampak kaj po vaše ta Janševa, ne samo retorika, tudi dejanja pomenijo za Slovenijo z nekako zunanje političnega vidika, ker država, katere predsednik vlade neusmiljeno tolče po novinarjih od vse povsod, ne samo v naši državi, ima najbrž verjetno težko nek zgleden sloves.
Well, I'm sure that it certainly doesn't help his reputation in some circles, but I think, the main thing is for me, going back to what other speakers were talking about, is the effect on self-censorship and sort of the impact that it has on journalists being able to do their jobs. And I think, unfortunately, it's a willful or not misunderstanding of what journalism is. Journalism is by nature critical. Journalism is by nature adversarial. A journalism which is not irritating, annoying, criticizing and questioning politicians isn't journalism. And that, I think, understanding is obviously, or it doesn't appear to be there. And it's not our role. We're not a political organization. It's not our role to speak about the Prime Minister's reputation. We're really more interested in how we can defend journalists, and I think ensure that they remain empowered to do their jobs, which is asking tough questions and being adversarial, even in a difficult environment such as Slovenia, where journalists are being attacked, where they are being smeared, and where they are being delegitimized. And part of that is raising awareness about these cases, and the other part is providing support to journalists who are the targets of such attacks, which is what we are trying to do in different ways together with our partners. This is, on the one hand, obviously moral support, but obviously practical and legal support. We have our Media Freedom Rapid Response, which we belong to, which is providing legal support, or which has the ability to provide legal support to journalists who are under threat, to provide practical support to journalists who are under threat, and raise these cases at a higher level so that they receive the attention that they deserve and journalists feel that they are not alone. And it's explaining to media outlets how they can protect their staff who feel threatened and who therefore feel that they don't want to write about certain topics, because they will be attacked online, they will be the victim of trolls, and I don't think that these issues, unfortunately, I don't see them disappearing in the short term. So we're really looking at how we can, as I said, ensure that journalists are empowered and they don't give in to this temptation of self-censorship, which I can understand or I can imagine is a big one. If you are being attacked from the biggest political office in the country with a huge number of followers, it's going to have an impact, whether you admit it or not, on your self-confidence and ability to do your job. And I think this is a key area where we need to work on. And I think this is really the micro response to the problem. I think the macro response is again coming back to the wider regional issues. That the lack of response in Hungary and Poland. I do think it is giving space to other leaders who are antagonistic to the media, who want to undermine the role of media in society, and the lack of action, not only over the past 10 years in Hungary, but even now as we sit here, the lack of concrete results in terms of European Union, European Commission responses to the flouting of fundamental rights in Hungary and Poland. Again, I think it's accelerating these trends in both in those countries, but in other countries like Slovenia as well. So unless you deal with those root problems, these issues are going to stay with us. And maybe a third point, the attacks, the verbal attacks on journalists, the smear campaigns are a huge issue, and we need to deal with them. But I think we also need to keep an eye on these other structural, I would say, threats to the public broadcaster, to the news agency, because these are also issues that at the end of the day will severely impact the public's right to information. The attacks are very loud, but what is also going on behind the scenes in terms of bringing media in line with a government message. And I think it's also important here to note the investment by Fidesz in the Slovenian media landscape, that we also shouldn't be distracted and forget about these also fundamental issues which are happening in the background, and that's why we are also as IPI trying to really shed a light on these as well, to ensure that the news agency, that the public broadcaster, but also that the wider media landscape remains a pluralistic media landscape. And that also involves, supporting media, supporting journalists financially to ensure that this landscape can remain, and that we don't end up with a completely one-sided media market as we do it right now in Hungary.
Preden nadaljujemo, samo za poslušalke in poslušalce, podaljšali bomo za akademskih 15, tako da imamo še 10 minut časa, toliko, da zaključimo ta sklop in potem v tretjem še za nas ne, še za seveda zaključne besede, da potem pustim gostom še v tretjem krogu. Zdaj grem pa na gospod Zakonšek in na Slovensko tiskovno agencijo, ker me predvsem zanima, gospod Zakonšek, vaše stališče z vidika kršenja izvajanja zakona o STA. Zdaj vemo, da je direktor omogočil vpoglede v dokumentacijo vladi, čeprav razumem, poteza ne nujno ravno stoji. Kakšne so pa pravno možne in predvsem pravno najbolj smiselne poteze zdaj, da se ta situacija uredi, da se zagotovijo ta izplačila, ki jih vlada zakonsko tako ali tako mora izpolniti do STA-ja?
Mogoče, če lahko se samo vrnem na to, kar sta moja sogovornika zdaj omenjala, oziroma so sogovorniki omenjali. Novinarji, seveda je jasno, da so relativno javne osebe, tako rečem, kar pomeni, da v zvezi z njihovim delom je dopustno Kritika je dopustna tudi glede na prakso ESČP in tudi prakso Slovenskega ustavnega sodišča, tudi ostra, neprizanesljiva, groba kritika, ampak dokler se nanaša na kritiko njihovega dela. V trenutku, ko preide na osebni napad, na napad na ki je zgolj zakamufliran morda kot kritika dela, to ni več nekaj, kar bi novinarji morali trpeti. In tudi novinarji imajo debelo kožo, na momente bi so rekli, da imajo morda novinarke, še posebej žal zaradi tega, kar nekako sprejemajo kot del njihovega poklica, celo morda predebelo kožo. Tako da druga stvar, ki sem jo želela reči, je tudi, da seveda aktualna vlada, daleč od tega, da bi bila to edina vlada, ki bi bili novinarji na poti, ravno tako, ravno zaradi tega, kar je rekel gospod Griffin, novinarji in novinarke zaradi narave svojega dela so v bistvu nekako vsaki vladi najbrž zoprni, ker sprašujejo stvari, ki pač najbrž ne bi vlade rade, da so del javne debate. Ampak morda ravno res zaradi pač narave družbenih medijev, zaradi nekega neposrednega dostopa do volilne baze se je v zadnjih mesecih, letih, ne samo v Sloveniji, tudi recimo v drugih demokracijah, konec koncev Amerika je najbolj tak glasen primer, se je to intenziteta teh napadov bistveno povečala, pa tudi nenazadnje najbrž učinki. Kar sem želela še reči, je, da tudi Slovenija in enako velja za Poljsko, Madžarsko, niso osamljene in nimajo edine teh problemov. Kritiki, novinarji, tudi kritiki iz akademskega sveta in tako naprej, so deležni številnih napadov, zato se mi zdi zelo dobro, da je Evropska komisija začela to temo tako imenovanih slep tožb, se pravi tožb, ki nimajo namena, kako bi rekla, dobiti sodnega postopka, ampak je njihov namen zaradi dolgotrajnosti finančnih vložkov pač povezanih v zvezi s sodnim postopkom, utišati kritika, utišati novinarja, novinarko. Skratka, to ni problem, ki bi ga doživljala samo Slovenija, ampak je prisoten v številnih državah. Amerika ima s tem že nekaj več izkušenj in zdaj se tudi znotraj Evropske unije pripravljajo neki mehanizmi, ki bi zagotovili, da se pač te sklep tožbe ne bi dogajali oziroma da bi bil njihov vpliv pač minimiziran. Glede STA je pa mogoče za enega pravnika nekoliko situacija nenavadna v tem smislu, ker se neko zelo specifično vprašanje zaradi pač teh razmer rešuje preko zakonodajne intervencije in ker ker zakoni načeloma so pisani za neke splošne situacije. In zato je v bistvu tudi za pravnika zelo težko to situacijo nekako razumeti. In mislim pa, da je prav, da se tudi preko teh mehanizmov pravnih pač poskuša doseči to, da bi Slovenska tiskovna agencija lahko normalno delovala. Je pa pač, se pravi, situacija tako do te točke pripeljana, da v bistvu se Slovenska tiskovna agencija, njen obstoj rešuje na način, ki ne bi bil ravno nek normalen način za zagotavljanje financiranja tiskovne agencije. Tako da od zunaj v bistvu je tudi glede na neke poteze zelo težko komentirati te pravne postopke, ker so tako zelo nenavadni.
Hvala lepa. Gospod Milosavljević, kaj bi si vi želeli videti na področju medijev pri nas? Bom kar tako vprašala, pa izvolite. Jaz vas ne slišim, ne vem pa, če vas slišijo ostali. Mogoče se imate na mute.
Pardon, jaz sem pozabil.
Okej, dobro, načelno.
Skratka, gre za vprašanje, o katerem bi se dalo govoriti verjetno do jutri. Ampak če smo nekoliko realni in nekoliko kratkoročni, mislim, da je trenutna situacija je na nek način približno naslednja. Imamo nek krog zelo aktivnih ljudi, politikov, sledilcev, podpornikov na Twitterju, ki gotovo poskušajo ustvariti vtis, da je neko vsesplošno javno mnenje takšno, kot ga oni želijo prikazati in kot ga oni prezentirajo. Na drugi strani imamo nekaj medijev, ki so javni, kot je javna radiotelevizija in STA, in mislim, da se seveda trenutna vlada zaveda, da njihov krog sledilcev na Twitterju je vendarle nek, recimo temu krožek, nek tako imenovani prostor odmeva, echo chamber, v katerih si ljudje, in to so rodni ljudje in vendarle relativno malo številni ljudje, nenehno pripovedujejo enake perspektive. Če želijo biti bolj uspešni, morajo zasesti javne medije oziroma javne splošne medije, ne družbenih medijev. Prvi korak je gotovo javna radiotelevizija in STA, in potem seveda verjetno sledijo pritiski ali poskusi dogovorov z lastniki določenih ključnih zasebnih medijev, ali so to radijske postaje, televizijske postaje ali pa določeni tiskani mediji, bodisi da zmanjšajo svojo stopnjo kritičnosti, bodisi da se jih prestraši, da se utišajo z raznimi poskusi pregona, z raznimi preiskavami in tako naprej. Tisto, kar bi bilo možno na nek način storiti v tem prostoru in v tem trenutku, je seveda predvsem sistematičen nastop praktično celotne kritične in hkrati demokratične slovenske javnosti. To pomeni vse institucije in vse ravni družbe, ki so bile na tak ali drugačen način napadene, šikanirane in tako naprej, in se jih je poskušalo utišati, in seznam je zelo dolg, bi v resnici morale seveda na tak ali drugačen način pokazati svojo demokratično držo. Govorim o tožilstvu, govorim o ustavnem sodišču, govorim o raznih drugih institucijah, napadeni so bili statistični urad, napadeni so bili razni muzeji, napaden je bilo računsko sodišče in mnoge druge institucije v tej državi. Demokratična družba temelji na delitvi oblasti in temelji tudi na raznoliki vlogi raznih organizacij in institucij znotraj tega. Mediji in njihova vloga je, kot je omenil gospod Griffin, predvsem ta kritična vloga. Nek bivši urednik The Guardiana pred skoraj 100 leti je dejal, da vse, kar mediji oziroma kar naj bi novinarji delali in objavljali, je nekaj, kar nekdo hoče prikriti oziroma skriti. Samo to je pravo novinarstvo. Vse ostalo so odnosi z javnostmi. In vloga medijev in novinarstva ni takšna, kot je bila nekoč v socializmu ali komunizmu, kar je gotovo blizu na nek način nekaterim ljudem tudi iz trenutne vlade, ker so pač bili aktivni v prejšnjih časih kot člani komunistične partije, ampak vloga novinarjev in medijev ni ta propagandna vloga. Vloga ni biti nekakšen družbeno-politični delavec, ki zgolj poroča, kaj je nek politik povedal, ampak je preverjanje teh dejstev, preverjanje dokumentov, vrtanje, postavljanje kritičnih vprašanj in tako naprej. In če bodo novinarji to ustrezno počeli še naprej, če bodo tudi njihovi lastniki stali ob svojih novinarjih in se tudi odzvali seveda na napade tudi na same sebe in na svoj na nek način medijski ekosistem, in če se bo temu seveda jasno na nek način oglasila tudi ostala sfera, torej od sodstva do akademskih in raznih strokovnih, ne samo kulturniških, ampak tudi pravniških, ekonomskih, oglaševalskih in tako naprej krogov, potem na nek način je to na nek način izvedljivo. kratkoročno gledano, zelo kratkoročno, in pa seveda ključna stvar nekega razmerja v državnem zboru, v parlamentu in vprašanja ohranjanja neke koalicije ali pač spremembe razmišljanja nekaterih poslancev, ali želijo v takšnem sistemu in v takšni vladi ali v takšni, bi rekel, ideji, kaj Slovenija je ali kaj ni, še naprej sodelovati.
Hvala lepa. Zdaj bom dala še vsakmu od vas recimo minutko, no, ali pa mogoče še mičkrat manj za ene take zaključne besede. Najprej vam, gospod Šarec, moja zaključna misel bo, da so dejstva včasih bolj bizarna od fikcije, in se mi zdi, da ta stavek lahko zelo dobro opiše predvsem to, o čemer smo govorili v tem drugem delu.
Ja, res je, se strinjam in moram reči, da se tudi v celoti strinjam s tem, kar je zdaj gospod Milosavljević povedal. Mislim, da je to bistvo vsega. Če recimo Giulio Andreotti, večkratni italijanski premier, je nekoč dejal, da nikoli ne dajaj popravka v medije, ker s tem boš samo še enkrat opozoril. Skratka, je vedel, da z mediji se ne prepira, da so svoja veja oblasti, če lahko tako rečem, in v celoti se strinjam s tem, da je vloga danes drugačna. In to, kar je gospod Milosavljević zdaj povedal, je ključno. Se pravi, vsi na noge, vsi tudi potem se angažirati, ko bodo volitve, ne da bomo danes vsi jamrali, ko so pa volitve, pa ni nikjer nikogar, ne. In če bomo tako ravnali, se pravi, samo zaščitno ravnanje je to, da se razumemo, in zaščita demokracije, potem se bodo zadeve tudi spremenile. Tako da mislim, da je to ključno. Ne zaspati, ne se pustiti ustrahovati, kajti ni nas tako malo. Samo res je, ekstremi so vedno glasni, zato so ekstremi.
Gospod Grifan, minutka za vaše zaključne besede, mogoče misel, kaj odnesti od današnje razprave. Jaz mislim, da je bila zelo zanimiva ura in pol oziroma dobra ura in pol.
Yeah, I mean, I would just highlight in the end the systemic or systematic nature of the problem that we have in Hungary and Poland. And I think it relates to what the two previous speakers were talking about, involving, all democratic institutions, because this is what we saw in Hungary, that the control of the state, we're not just talking about media freedom, also, as Jasna was saying, that we see state control over numerous aspects of public life and different types of public institutions. Academic freedom is restricted, civil society, the activities of civil society are restricted, the activities of the public prosecutor are restricted, judiciary is compromised, and there's an interplay between all of these actors, the media, whatever the media comes up with in Hungary, whatever investigations come out, it's extremely difficult to have an impact if every other institution is co-opted. And I think that also what Mr. Milosavljević was mentioning, we really worry about the future of other democratic institutions besides the media. And I think that it makes sense to have this kind of coalition of institutions of democratic governance and democratic life. And maybe again, also as part of this systemic threat, again, it's not just for us, the individual attacks on journalists. It's not individual criticism, a criticism there or a harsh criticism there. It's the systemic nature of it, a comprehensive effort to use certain narratives to undermine the work of journalists and to basically tarnish their reputation in front of the public. And it's not just, the individual situation of one media outlet. It's the larger systematic effort to infiltrate the media market. And as Mr. Milosavljević was also mentioning, the fear that, this will not stop at public media, but it will eventually target also private media and somehow, using different levers of state power, which is what we saw in Hungary, using different public institutions that were co-opted by the Fidesz party to bring private media under control. And these are the types of developments that we need to be extremely vigilant about and ensure that we don't end up again with this type of completely co-opted media market that we have in Hungary and Poland. Slovenia still has media pluralism. It still has a vibrant media. It still has a lot of tons of courageous journalists who are doing their job, and that is what we need to preserve.
Hvala lepa, gospa Zakonjšek. Še vas zaključek na kratko, prosim.
Ja, jaz lahko povem iz tega, pač z moje perspektive, recimo, da tudi jaz zaključim na eni bolj optimistični noti. Meni se zdi zelo pomembno ravno to, kar so tudi sogovorniki prej omenjali, da v bistvu demokracija ne stoji in konec koncev tudi ne pade samo na svobodnem novinarstvu, ampak tudi na pravosodju in recimo jaz vam tukaj največ povezave vidim med tem, da očitno imamo še in upam, da bomo vedno imeli tudi zaupanje v naš pravosodni sistem in da je recimo Evropsko sodišče za človekove pravice skoraj da ni sodbe v zvezi s svobodo izražanja, kjer ne bi bila sodna praksa ISČP-ja izčrpno citirana, sodniki jo spremljajo, poznajo, tako da jaz upam, da seveda ne sme biti pozornost samo na medije dana, ampak pač na vse institucije demokracije in upam, da pač da optimizem se ne bo izkazal za zgrešen, ampak seveda ne optimizem, ki bi uspaval. In tako da mislim, da je tudi dobro tukaj, da je mednarodna pozornost usmerjena, ker nam nekako tudi daje vsem, ki smo tukaj občutek, da pač nismo v tem sami.
Hvala, ker ste izpostavili tudi ta vidik, se absolutno strinjam z vami. Gospod Milosavljević, še vaša minutka.
Hvala lepa. Kratkoročno bi temu rekel, če citiram enega našega slovenskega političnega govorca, naslednjih 14 dni bo odločilnih. Namreč kmalu dobimo novega generalnega direktorja javne radiotelevizije in po drugi strani bo verjetno precej hitro jasno, kaj bo vlada ukrenila v zvezi z STA v naslednjih dneh oziroma tednih, ali pa bo vlekla situacijo še naprej in želela izčrpati do konca, ali zdaj, ko je dobila dokumente, kaj se bo zgodilo. Toliko glede javnih medijev, torej mislim, da bojo nekatere stvari relativno se pokazale ali začele kazati že v mesecu maju. Na splošno gledano, pa mislim, da je zelo pomembno ravno nek splošen odnos javnosti. Ljudi, da se zavedamo, da živimo v Evropski uniji, živimo v demokraciji, časi totalitarizma so minili, časi avtokratov so minili. Vsi skupaj moramo na nek način delovati za to, da ohranjamo to demokracijo. In ta demokracija mora funkcionirati za dobro nas, za dobro bit te Evrope, za dobrobit vrednot te Evrope, navsezadnje za našo prihodnost, za katero smo si toliko let prizadevali, da postanemo članica te Evropske unije. In zato je potrebno predvsem na nek način odločnost in seveda odsotnost strahu. To je zavedanje, da nekateri ljudje, tako kot v realnem življenju, funkcionirajo na nek način agresivno, funkcionirajo kot nekakšni nadlegovalci ali buliji, ampak njihov uspeh je zagotovljen samo, če so ljudje tiho in če se seveda ustrašijo. Če ljudje nastopijo odločno, če nastopijo jasno, se seveda te stvari zelo hitro lahko razblinejo, lahko že v trenutni konstelaciji državnega zbora ali pa seveda ob naslednjih volitvah.
Hvala lepa, jaz se lahko samo podpišem pod te besede in se zahvalim, res zelo lepo zahvalim vsem štirim. Tudi tolmačkam se lepo zahvaljujem in vsem ostalim v ekipi. Seveda pa tudi hvala poslušalkam in poslušalcem tudi za potrpežljivost. Malo smo podaljšali, upam, da ne zamerite, ampak zdela se mi je tako zelo zanimiva in predvsem pomembna razprava, da nekako nisem želela prekinjati govorcev ali karkoli krajšati. Tako da upam, da ste tudi vi odnesli od vsega skupaj ogromno. Jaz menim, da smo ne samo odprli veliko vprašanj, ampak tudi našli kar precej možnih odgovorov in naj tokrat ne ostane samo pri besedah. Tako da res najlepša hvala še enkrat vsem.
Hvala lepa.
Hvala lepa, nasvidenje.
Nasvidenje.